for many street kids, working-class children, to benefit from public education. They're incapable of learning to read and write, and why are we spending time on this? So there's also built into it a whole series of assumptions about social structure and capacity. But it was designed for its purpose, which is why, as the public system evolved in the 19th and early 20th century, we ended up with a very broad base of elementary education, junior schools. Everybody went to that. My father's father, my grandfather, he went to that. He left school by the time he was 12. Most people did then, at the turn of the century. And then gradually we introduced a layer above it of secondary education, and some people went into that, but my father left school at 14, having gone into that. And then a small university sector sat across the top of it. And the assumption was that people would work there, and a few would get to the top and would go to university. It was modelled on the economic premises of industrialism. That is, that we needed a broad base of people to do manual blue-collar work, and roughly they could do language and arithmetic. A smaller group who would go to administrative work, that's what the grammar schools were for, and an even smaller group who would go off and run the empire for us and become the lawyers and the judges and the doctors, and they were the universities. Now, I simplify, but that's essentially how the thing came about. And it was driven by an economic imperative of the time, but running right through it was an intellectual model of the mind, which was essentially the Enlightenment view of intelligence. That real intelligence consists in the capacity for a certain type of deductive reasoning and a knowledge of the classics originally, what we come to think of as academic ability. And this is deep in the gene pool of public education, that there are really two types of people, academic and non-academic, smart people and non-smart people. And the consequence of that is that many brilliant people think they're not, because they've been judged against this particular view of the mind. So we have twin pillars, economic and intellectual. And my view is that this model has caused chaos in many people's lives. It's been great for some. There have been people who have benefited wonderfully from it. But most people have not. And it's created a massive problem. I spoke at a conference, the TED conference that Matthew referred to. One of the other speakers was Al Gore, or Al, as I refer to him. Al Gore gave the talk at the TED conference. By the way, if you don't know the TED conference, I do recommend you visit the website, ted.com. It is fantastic. But Al Gore gave the talk that became the movie Inconvenient Truth. Al Gore's view, which isn't his, he'd be the first to say it, it dates back to Rachel Carson and earlier. It actually dates back, if you look, even to the work of Linnaeus in the 18th century. It dates back to Franklin. It dates back to the work of this society. A concern with the ecology of the natural world and the sustainability of industrialism in the 17th and 18th century. We were concerned about it. But his work is an attempt to put the case back into a modern context. I believe he's right. And it's not just his view. A group of geologists have recently published a paper in which they argue that the Earth has entered a new geological period. Classically, the view is that since the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, we're in a period called the Holocene period. They believe we've entered a new period. And they say if people were to, a future generation of geologists were to come to Earth, they would see the evidence of it, of a change in the Earth's geological personality. They would see it in the evidence of carbon deposits in the Earth's crust, the acidification of oceans, the evidence of the mass extinction of species, the change in the Earth's atmosphere, and 100 other indicators. They say it's unmistakably, in their view, a new geological period. And a series of Nobel scientists have agreed to this view. They're provisionally calling this, not the Holocene, but the Anthropocene. What they mean by that is a geological age created by the activities of people, as in anthropos. And they say there's no historical precedent for this. And this is really what I want to get to. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, William Shipley, the great figures of the Enlightenment, both in politics and science and the arts, were conceiving public education and civic structures and politics of duty at a time of revolutionary turmoil. It was the age of revolutions. In France, in America, not long after our civil disturbance here, at a time of extraordinary intellectual adventures and new horizons, extraordinary innovation. For them, there was nothing really that had ever led to an age of such innovation and such extraordinary change, the rate of it. And it was a fair characterization of the times. But there's every evidence to show now that what was happening then is as nothing to what is happening now. I believe the changes taking place on Earth now are without precedent in terms of their character and their implications. And our best salvation is to develop this capacity for imagination and to do it systematically through public education and to connect people with their true talents. We simply can't afford this devastation anymore. So when Al Gore talks about this, I believe him. And I think if you don't think there's a crisis in the world's natural environment, then you're not paying attention. And I would take the option to leave the planet soon, really. But you see, I believe that there is a parallel climate crisis. Now, one of them is probably enough for you, honestly. You might think, no, I'm fine, one is good. You know, I don't need a second one. But there is a second one. And it's what my work is about, and I guess what many of you will be concerned about. And I know what EDGE is concerned about and what Matthew and the RSA is currently concerned about. But let me put it a particular way to you. I believe there is a global crisis, not in natural resources, though I believe it, a global crisis in human resources. I believe that the parallel with the crisis in the natural world is exact. And the costs of clearing this up are catastrophic. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. In California, the state government last year spent about $3 billion on the state university system. This is their published figures. They spent over $9 billion on the state prison system. Now, I cannot believe that more potential criminals are born every year in California than potential college graduates. What you have are people in bad conditions going bad. I remember Bernard Levin once, he wrote one of his articles in the Times, he said he'd been at a dinner party, and he was asked, the question around the dinner table was, are people mainly good or mainly bad? And he said without hesitation, they're mainly good. He said, and I was astonished to find I was in the minority around the table, a minority of one. But he believed with Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust and saw his parents die, that for all of that, people are fundamentally good. I believe they are fundamentally good. But there are people living in very bad circumstances and conditions. And if you put people in poor conditions, they behave in particular ways. So we spend a lot of our time remediating the damage. And meanwhile, I think that the other exact parallel is that pharmaceutical companies are reaping a gold rush from this distress. But if you look at the growth of antidepressants, of prescription drugs to treat depression, to suppress people's feelings, this is a gold rush. I mean, pharmaceutical companies don't want to cure depression. On the contrary. I mean, also, one of the figures I saw recently is that suicide rates among 15 to 30-year-olds have increased over 60% globally since the 1960s. It's one of the largest causes of death among young people. I mean, what is that? You know, people born with hope and optimism who decide to check out because they can't cope. Now, I don't say education's part of that or responsible for it, but it contributes to it. That's really all I want to say. So this crisis of human resources is, I think, absolutely urgent and palpable. So the challenge for me is not to reform education, but to transform it into something else. I think we have to come to a different set of assumptions. Now, I say this advisedly because I've been involved in all kinds of initiatives over my professional life. I started out in drama work. I ran a big arts and schools project. Some of the people in the room I've known for years and have worked with for years, and I've had a long association here. One of the great initiatives of the RSA in the 1980s was Education for Capability. You should look at Education for Capability. It said extraordinarily useful and practical things, and there were wonderful people around it. Charles Handy, who I've got to know recently, well, not recently, but I've got to know well in recent years, who was chairman here of the RSA. Tyrrell Burgess, Corelli Barnett, Patrick Nutchins. I shared an apartment when I was a student with Patrick's son. and a galaxy of really powerful thinkers. John Tomlinson, who was chairman here for a while, who was with me at Warwick University. There has been a long tradition of arguing for the change, arguing for the alternative, and yet successive governments come in and do what they did before. And this really worries me, and I speak personally, that after all the optimism I felt 10 years ago, I feel that we've had, over the past 10 years, a kind of myriad of policies, but too few principles. I can't see what they've added up to. And I say that because I didn't see it before, and I don't see it anywhere else. I mean, there are some countries which I feel are getting this right, but we're not. And the reason is because we're not fundamentally changing the underlying assumptions of the system, which are to do with intelligence, ability, economic purpose, and what people need. We still educate people from the outside in. We figure out what the country needs, then we try and get them to conform with it, rather than seeing what makes people drive forward and building education systems around a model of personhood, which is what I think we should come to. So I just want to show you a couple of quick slides to... I don't have to, but as I've gone to the trouble of preparing them, frankly, I just want to give you an example of a couple of things here. Oh, by the way, some of these things, as Matthew kindly said, are in this book. This book, by the way, is terrific. Okay? You could not do better than buy this book. That is, unless you buy this book, which is the new book, which is coming out in January from Penguin. I'm very excited about this book. This book is about the nature of human talent and how people discover it. It's based on the premise that people do their best when they do the thing they love, when they're in their element. So I was trying to get to grips with what that is. What is it to be in your element? And I spoke to scientists and artists and business leaders and poets and parents and kids. And it seems to me the evidence is absolutely persuasive. When people connect to this powerful sense of talent in themselves, discover what it is they can do, they become somebody else. And that, to me, is the premise of building a new education system. It's not about reinforcing the old model, but reconstituting our sense of self. And it happens to synergize, is that a verb? I'm not sure, with the new economic purposes. There are two big drivers of change currently. One is technology, you know that. This is a brain cell. What I just want, I'm not going to dwell on it, but what I want to underline is that technology is moving faster than most people really truthfully understand. Can I ask you, how many of you here consider yourself to be baby boomers or older? I thought so. All of you, who is not? Who considers yourself to be a Generation Xer or a millennial? Okay. You boomer types and older, actually no, if you're over 30, would you put your hand up if you were wearing a wristwatch? There we go, thank you. Just curious. Now, no, this is interesting. Ask a room full of teenagers the same question. Ask them if they wear wristwatches. They mainly don't. And the reason is, I want to make 2 points. The reason they don't wear wristwatches is because they don't see the point. Because for them, time is everywhere. You know, it's on their iPhones, their iPods, their mobile phones, it's everywhere. You know, why would you wear this? I mean, my daughter can't understand why I would put a special device on my wrist to tell the time. You know, and she said, plus this only does one thing. It's like, how lame is that? You know, like a single-function device. So have you cracked up? But we take it for granted, don't we? You have other options, but this thing about taking it for granted is important. It's the things we take for granted that we need to kind of identify and question. I mean, did you think about putting your watch on this morning? Truthfully, was it like an agony? Shall I? You know, is it a watchy day? I just don't know, really. I'll put it on to be safe. You know, you don't do, you just do it. Our kids don't, and it points to something important. A guy called Mark Prensky made this point, that our children live in a different world. He talks about the difference between digital natives and digital immigrants. If you're under 20, you're an immigrant, you're a native. You speak digital. You were born with this stuff, and it's in your head like a first language. We're less so. But the point is, this is getting faster and faster and faster. One of the new horizons is likely to be the merging of human intelligence with information systems. That's a brain cell, and that's a brain cell growing on a silicon chip. Well, we'll see. But there are things that lie ahead for which there are no precedent. And the impact on culture promises to be extraordinary. This is the other thing I want to point to, which